Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The needle gleamed like a threat in the lamplight, longer than any instrument Marlowe had ever seen, and the giant woman holding it looked more terrified than he felt. Blood soaked through his shirt, spreading dark and warm across his ribs where the bullet had torn through flesh and lodged itself against bone. The pain came in waves that made his vision blur, but he could see her hands shaking, see the way her throat worked as she swallowed hard. She was easily 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they could snap wood, yet those same hands trembled like autumn leaves. Her wedding dress, stained now with his blood and the dust from the road, hung on her like a ghost's costume. This wasn't how either of them had imagined their day would end. "I can't," she whispered, and the needle dipped lower, catching the light again. Her accent was strange, clipped and foreign, nothing like the drawling voices of Copper Ridge. Marlowe could see tears gathering in her eyes, making them shine in the dim cabin. Outside, the desert wind howled through the canyon, rattling the shutters like skeletal fingers trying to get in. His horse whinnied nervously from where it stood tied near the door, sensing the wrongness in the air. The woman took a step back, nearly dropping the instrument, and Marlowe felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with blood loss. If she didn't do this, if she couldn't find the courage, he would die here on this wooden table in a stranger's cabin, miles from anyone who knew his name. The cabin smelled of herbs and something sweet, like bread that had been baking all day. Jars lined the shelves, filled with liquids and dried plants he couldn't identify. A medical bag sat open on the counter, its contents spilled out in organized chaos. Bandages, bottles, more needles, scissors, thread. This woman was a nurse. He'd figured that much out before the pain had made thinking difficult. But why was she wearing a wedding dress? Why was she alone out here? And why did she look at him like he was a test she was destined to fail? Her hands came up to her face, covering her mouth, and he heard a sound escape her throat that was half sob, half prayer. The bullet in his side pulsed with his heartbeat, sending fresh waves of agony through his body. "Listen to me," Marlowe said through gritted teeth, each word costing him. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by pain. "I know you're scared. I can see it. But if you don't get this bullet out, I'm dead anyway." He watched her eyes focus on him, really seeing him for the first time since he'd stumbled through her door. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that would have been beautiful if it wasn't pale with fear. Her wedding dress was expensive, he could tell that much, with tiny pearl buttons running up the back and lace that probably cost more than he made in 6 months. Someone had loved her enough to buy her that dress. Someone had wanted to marry this tall, frightened woman who now held his life in her shaking hands. "The man who shot me is still out there," Marlowe continued, watching her reaction. "He's riding with 2 others and they're coming this way. They saw me head toward this cabin." That got her attention. Her eyes widened, and he saw her glance toward the window where dust-colored curtains blocked out the fading daylight. "They want me dead, and they won't care about a woman in a wedding dress standing in their way. So you have 2 choices. You can let me die right now, or you can find whatever courage got you into that dress and pull this bullet out of me so I can protect us both when they arrive." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Outside, the wind grew stronger, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The woman's hands stopped shaking. She looked down at the needle, then back at Marlowe's face, and something shifted in her expression. Ingrid Halvorsen had crossed an ocean to become someone's wife, and now she stood at the altar of the small Copper Ridge church wondering if she'd made the greatest mistake of her life. The man beside her, Clayton Merrick, was handsome enough with his dark hair and sharp jaw, but his eyes held a coldness that made her skin prickle. She'd known him only through letters, beautiful letters full of promises about a ranch and a life of comfort in America. Her family in Norway had been so poor, 5 siblings crammed into a 2-room house, her father's fishing boat barely bringing in enough to feed them all. When Clayton's letter had arrived, forwarded by a distant cousin, it had seemed like providence. He'd seen her photograph, he wrote. He'd fallen in love with her strong Norwegian features. He wanted a wife who could work hard, who understood what it meant to build something from nothing. The church was nearly empty. That should have been her first warning. Clayton had explained it away easily enough. Most of his ranch hands were out on a cattle drive, his family lived back east, and he preferred intimate ceremonies anyway. But Ingrid had imagined pews filled with smiling faces, women in their Sunday best, children squirming in starched collars. Instead, there were 5 people. The preacher, a stern man with a voice like grinding stone, Clayton's foreman, a wiry man named Butch who watched her with undisguised hostility, a saloon girl Clayton had paid to be her witness, who looked bored and kept checking the tiny watch pinned to her dress, and 2 strangers in the back row who seemed more interested in the exits than the ceremony. The church itself was beautiful, with stained glass windows that threw colored light across the wooden floor, but the beauty felt wasted on this sparse, cold gathering. Clayton's hand on her arm was too tight, his fingers digging into her flesh through the silk of her dress. She'd spent every penny she'd saved on this dress, buying it from a seamstress in Oslo before she'd boarded the ship. It represented everything she'd dreamed of, a new beginning, a chance to be something more than just another poor fisherman's daughter. The voyage across the Atlantic had taken 3 weeks, and she'd spent most of it sick in the hold, dreaming of the moment she'd step onto American soil as a bride. But now, standing here in this empty church with a man whose smile never reached his eyes, doubt clawed at her throat like a living thing. When the preacher asked if she took Clayton to be her lawfully wedded husband, she opened her mouth and nothing came out. The silence stretched long enough that she saw anger flash across Clayton's face. "She's just nervous," Clayton said smoothly, his accent pure Western drawl, but his grip on her arm tightened painfully. "Aren't you, darling? Coming all this way, everything's so new and strange. Say yes, Ingrid. Say yes so we can start our life together." The way he said it wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in honey, and Ingrid felt something inside her rebel. She'd been raised to be obedient, to respect authority, to understand that a woman's role was to support her husband. But she'd also been raised by a father who'd taught her to gut fish, to read the weather, to trust her instincts when the sea looked calm but felt dangerous. And right now, every instinct she had was screaming at her to run. She looked at Clayton's face, saw something predatory lurking behind his patient smile, and made a decision that would change everything. "No," Ingrid said, and the word dropped into the church like a stone into still water. Clayton's face went blank with shock, then twisted into something ugly. His hand clamped down on her arm hard enough to bruise, and he leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "You'll regret that," he whispered, and there was such venom in his voice that Ingrid felt ice slide down her spine. Then she did something she'd never done in her life. She brought her knee up hard into Clayton's groin, exactly the way her older brother had taught her when she turned 16 and started getting unwanted attention from fishermen twice her age. Clayton went down with a howl, and Ingrid ran. Her wedding dress hampered her movement, the long train catching on pews, but she gathered it up in her arms and ran for the church doors. Behind her, she heard Butch curse, heard footsteps pounding after her, heard Clayton gasping orders through his pain. The late afternoon sun hit her face like freedom as she burst through the doors. Ingrid had never stolen anything in her life, but she stole the horse without hesitation. The bay mare was tied outside the general store, saddled and ready, probably belonging to some rancher picking up supplies. She hiked her wedding dress up around her thighs, showing her white stockings and boots to anyone watching, but she didn't care. Modesty meant nothing compared to survival. She grabbed the saddle horn and pulled herself up with strength built from years of hauling fishing nets, and the horse danced nervously under her weight. She was not a small woman, 5'11" in her bare feet, broad-shouldered and strong, and the horse seemed surprised by her size. But Ingrid had ridden before, had worked with her uncle's draft horses in Norway, and she knew how to make an animal understand who was in command. She dug her heels in, and the mare bolted down the dusty main street of Copper Ridge just as Butch came running out of the church. The town blurred past her in a confusion of wooden buildings and startled faces. Someone shouted after her, but the wind tore the words away. Ingrid leaned low over the horse's neck, her veil streaming behind her like a white flag of surrender, though surrender was the last thing on her mind. She'd learned English from a missionary who'd visited her village, learned it well enough to read Clayton's letters and respond with her own halting words. But she hadn't learned the English word for what she felt right now, this mixture of terror and exhilaration, this sense of having leaped off a cliff with no idea if there was water below. The desert landscape opened up before her, all red rock and scrub brush and endless sky, so different from the green fjords and gray seas of home that it might as well have been a different planet. The horse's hooves kicked up dust that coated her dress, turning the white silk brown. She didn't know where she was going. That was the truth that settled over her as the adrenaline began to fade and her breathing turned ragged. She had no money. Clayton had taken her small purse of coins when she'd arrived, promising to keep it safe, to manage their finances together. She had no food, no water, no supplies. She didn't know the land, didn't know which direction led to safety and which led to empty desert that would kill her in a matter of days. All she knew was that she couldn't go back, that whatever Clayton had planned for her was worse than dying of thirst under the brutal American sun. Her family had sacrificed to pay for her passage, had cried when she'd left, had made her promise to write as soon as she was settled. How could she tell them she'd run from her own wedding? How could she explain that the good Christian man who'd written such beautiful letters was actually someone who made her blood run cold? The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if Ingrid wasn't so scared. She could hear riders behind her now, could hear the thunder of hooves on packed earth. Clayton had sent men after her, of course he had. A woman like her, tall and strong and foreign, would be easy to spot even in a crowded town, and out here in the open desert she might as well have been waving a flag. The horse beneath her was tiring, foam flecking its mouth, and Ingrid knew she couldn't outrun them forever. Then she saw it, a small cabin tucked into a canyon, smoke rising from its chimney. It wasn't much, just a rough wooden structure that looked like it might blow away in a strong wind, but it was shelter. It was a chance. She aimed the horse toward it, praying to the God she'd learned about in her village church, the God who supposedly watched over lost sheep and strangers in foreign lands. The cabin door was unlocked. Out here, people still trusted each other, or maybe they just had nothing worth stealing. Ingrid burst inside, startling a cat that had been sleeping on a chair. The interior was simple but clean, with a proper bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a stove that still held warmth, and shelves lined with jars and bottles. Medical supplies, she realized with a jolt. This was a nurse's home, or maybe a doctor's. The bag on the counter was open, revealing bandages and instruments. Whoever lived here helped people. Surely they would help her too. She could hear the riders getting closer, their shouts carrying on the wind. There was no back door, no other way out. Ingrid looked around frantically, then spotted a cellar door built into the floor. She grabbed the handle and pulled, revealing a dark space below that smelled of earth and preserved food. She could hide there, let them pass, wait until... A gunshot cracked through the air, followed by a man's shout. Then the cabin door burst open, and a cowboy stumbled inside, blood soaking through his shirt, his face pale as death. He looked at Ingrid in her white dress standing in the middle of the cabin, looked at the medical bag on the counter, and said through gritted teeth, "Thank God. Are you the nurse?" Before she could answer, before she could explain that she was just a Norwegian fisherman's daughter who'd run from her own wedding, he collapsed onto the table, sending jars crashing to the floor. Outside, the riders were getting closer. Inside, the man was bleeding to death. And Ingrid Halvorsen, who had never made a real decision in her life without her father's approval, suddenly had to decide who she was going to be. The real nurse had been dead for 3 days. Ingrid discovered this when she finally looked in the bedroom, after she'd managed to stop staring at the bleeding cowboy on her table. The woman lay peaceful on the bed, hands folded across her chest, dressed in her nightgown. She was small and delicate, probably in her 60s, with white hair braided neatly down her back. Natural causes, Ingrid thought, seeing no signs of violence, just the quiet sleep that sometimes claimed the elderly in the night. Someone had laid her out properly, had closed her eyes and crossed her hands. Maybe she'd lived alone and done it herself, sensing the end coming. Maybe she'd prepared her own deathbed the way Ingrid's grandmother had, calmly and efficiently, treating death as just another task to be completed. The medical bag, the supplies, they were all still here because no one knew she was gone. This cabin was remote enough that visitors were rare. "Please," the cowboy gasped from the main room, and Ingrid snapped back to reality. She couldn't help the dead woman, but she could maybe help him. She looked at the medical bag again, at the instruments and bottles. In Norway, she'd helped her mother with births, had learned to stitch wounds when her brothers came home bleeding from fights or fishing accidents. She'd watched the village healers set broken bones, had ground herbs for poultices, had held a man's hand while her father cut an infected toe away with a knife heated in the fire. She wasn't a nurse, not officially, but she knew more than nothing. And right now, more than nothing might be enough. She picked up the bag and carried it to the table where the cowboy lay, his breathing shallow, his skin going gray. "I'm not a nurse," Ingrid said, her Norwegian accent making the words sound strange even to her own ears. "The nurse is dead. But I can try to help you." She saw his eyes widen, saw him process this information despite the pain. "I've treated wounds before, back home. I've seen bullets removed. I know some things." She was babbling now, nervous, her hands already reaching for the buttons of his shirt. She had to see the wound properly, had to understand what she was dealing with. The cowboy nodded, or maybe he just moved his head in pain, she couldn't tell. His shirt was soaked through, the blood still fresh and bright. That meant an artery might be involved, or maybe just a lot of small vessels. She'd know more when she got the shirt off. The wound was bad. Not the worst she'd seen. Her brother Sven had been gored by a boat hook once, and that had been truly terrible, but bad enough. The bullet had entered just below his ribs on the left side and was still lodged inside. She could see the lump of it under the skin further around his back. It needed to come out, and soon, or infection would set in. In Norway, they'd used vodka to clean wounds, but here she had something better, the nurse's bottles of carbolic acid and whiskey. She grabbed both, plus the longest probe she could find in the medical bag, and laid them out on the table. Her hands were shaking again, but she forced them steady. She'd told this man she could help him, and lying wasn't something she'd been raised to do, even to a stranger. Even to save his life. "This will hurt," Ingrid said, meeting his eyes. They were gray, like the North Sea before a storm, and despite the pain in them she saw something else, trust. He was trusting her, this giant foreign woman in a blood-stained wedding dress, because he had no other choice. "I need you to bite on this." She grabbed a wooden spoon from the counter and put it between his teeth. He bit down hard, nodding for her to continue. Ingrid poured whiskey over her hands, then over the wound, and the cowboy's body arched in pain. Then she picked up the probe, said a prayer in Norwegian that her mother had taught her, and began to search for the bullet. The metal scraped against bone, and the cowboy's scream, even muffled by the wooden spoon, seemed to fill the entire cabin. Outside, closer now, she heard horses and men's voices. Clayton had found her. They were coming. The bullet came out with a soft clicking sound, like a tooth being pulled, and Ingrid dropped it into a tin cup where it rang against the metal. Blood welled up fresh from the wound, but she'd expected that, had bandages ready. The cowboy had passed out somewhere during the extraction, his face pale as milk, his breathing shallow but steady. Better that he was unconscious for this part anyway. She worked quickly, packing the wound with carbolic-soaked cloth the way she'd seen the village healer do, then stitching the entry point with thread from the nurse's bag. Her stitches weren't beautiful, they looked like something a child might do, uneven and clumsy, but they held. That was what mattered. They held, and the bleeding was slowing, and the cowboy was still breathing. She'd kept him alive, at least for now. Outside, the voices grew louder. Ingrid recognized Clayton's drawl, smooth as honey and twice as dangerous. "I know she's in there. That's my horse outside. My wife ran off in the middle of our wedding, and I've come to bring her home where she belongs." He was using his reasonable voice, the one from his letters, the one that had fooled her into thinking he was a good man. But she could hear the undercurrent of rage beneath it, could imagine his face tight with anger. Another voice responded, unfamiliar and gravelly. "That's Marlowe's horse too. I'd recognize that ugly bay anywhere. He came this way after we shot him. Probably bleeding all over some poor woman's floor right now." So the cowboy had a name, Marlowe. and the men outside had shot him. Which meant Clayton was riding with outlaws, or was an outlaw himself. The beautiful letters, the promises of a ranch and a good life, all lies. Ingrid looked around the cabin desperately. The front door was the only entrance, and 3 men on horses waited outside. The bedroom held only a dead woman who couldn't help her. The cellar was too obvious, too easy to search. She could see the shadows of the men through the curtains, see them dismounting, see Clayton's tall form approaching the door. The cowboy, Marlowe, was still unconscious on the table, helpless as a baby. If they came in shooting, they'd kill him. They'd probably kill her too, or worse. Clayton had made it clear what he thought of women who said no to him. She needed a weapon, needed some way to protect them both. Her eyes fell on the stove, still warm from the nurse's last fire, and an idea formed in her mind. She worked fast, grabbing the kettle of water that sat on the stove and setting it directly on the hottest part of the fire. It was already warm, would boil quickly. Then she found the carbolic acid, the bottle nearly full, and positioned herself by the door with it in one hand. With her other hand, she grabbed the largest knife from the nurse's kitchen, a butcher's blade that looked like it could gut a whale. She was 6 feet tall and strong from years of physical labor. She wouldn't go down easily. The door handle began to turn, and Ingrid felt something shift inside her, a hardness, a coldness, something that had been sleeping all her life and had finally woken up. Clayton thought he owned her because he'd paid for her passage, because she'd signed a paper in a church. But Ingrid Halvorsen belonged to no one but herself. The door burst open, and Clayton stood there with his 2 companions, all 3 armed with pistols. He saw her in her ruined wedding dress, saw the knife in her hand, and his face twisted into something ugly. There you are, what? Time to come home. But before he could take another step, before his companions could raise their guns, Ingrid threw the carbolic acid straight into Clayton's face. He screamed, a high terrible sound, his hands going to his burning eyes. The other 2 men froze in shock, and that was when Ingrid grabbed the boiling kettle and swung it in a wide arc, sending scalding water across all 3 of them. The men scattered, cursing and screaming, and Ingrid slammed the door shut, throwing the bolt. It wouldn't hold them for long, but it would buy her time. Time to figure out what to do next. Time to maybe, possibly, survive this impossible day. Marlowe opened his eyes to chaos. He could hear men shouting outside, cursing and threatening, could smell burning flesh and carbolic acid, could feel the dull throb in his side that meant he was either alive or in some very strange version of hell. The giant woman in the wedding dress stood by the door with a knife that looked like it could skin a buffalo, her chest heaving, her face set in an expression of absolute determination. She'd saved his life. He remembered that much through the haze of pain. She'd dug the bullet out with shaking hands while he'd tried not to scream. And now she was defending them both against what sounded like at least 3 men, with nothing but kitchen implements and courage. Marlowe had met a lot of women in his 30 years, but he'd never met one quite like this. How many bullets do you have? The woman asked without turning around, her accent thick and foreign. Marlowe tried to sit up, hissed at the pain, and managed to prop himself on one elbow. His gun was still in his holster, he could feel the weight of it. He pulled it out with clumsy fingers, checked the chamber. 4, he said, his voice rough as gravel. And a rifle on my horse if it's still out there. The woman nodded, still watching the door like a hawk watching a snake. 3 men outside. One is burned badly from acid, the others are angry but hurt. The burned one, Clayton, he says I am his wife. But I am not his wife. I ran from the wedding. I stole a horse. Now they want to kill us both, I think. Marlowe processed this information slowly, his pain-fogged brain trying to make sense of it. The woman was a runaway bride, and the men outside were her jilted groom and his friends. Which meant they probably weren't just going to shoot through the door, they'd want her alive, at least at first. That gave them an advantage, slim as it was. The men who shot me, Marlowe said, forcing the words out, they're cattle rustlers. I've been tracking them for 3 weeks. They stole 50 head from a ranch outside Copper Ridge, killed a 14-year-old boy who tried to stop them. I'm a sheriff's deputy. He tapped the badge in his pocket, hidden under his bloody shirt. The man who shot me, Butch Cavendish, he's wanted in 3 territories. If your Clayton is riding with him, then your Clayton is an outlaw too. The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, just for a moment, and Marlowe saw something break in her expression. Some last hope that maybe this had all been a misunderstanding, that maybe Clayton was a good man having a bad day. But good men didn't ride with murderers, and they both knew it. My name is Ingrid, she said quietly. Ingrid Halvorsen. From Norway. I came here to be married, to have a better life than fishing in the cold sea. But I think I came to the wrong place. Marlowe wanted to tell her that America wasn't all like this, that there were good people and safe places, but the words stuck in his throat. He'd seen too much darkness in his years wearing the badge, too many betrayals and cruelties. Sometimes the wrong place found you no matter where you went. Well, Ingrid from Norway, Marlowe said, managing to sit up fully despite the pain that lanced through his side. My name is Marlowe Garrett, and I'm going to make sure you live to regret that wedding. She turned to look at him then, and a ghost of a smile crossed her face, the first smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her features, made her look younger, less like a warrior and more like the woman she might have been in a different life. Outside, the men were regrouping. Marlowe could hear them arguing about strategy, about whether to burn the cabin or wait them out. Clayton's voice was strained, tight with pain, demanding they get Ingrid out alive so he could teach her what happened to women who embarrassed him. Butch's voice was calmer, more pragmatic. He wanted to kill them both and be done with it, didn't care about Clayton's wounded pride. Marlowe forced himself to his feet, swaying slightly, one hand pressed to his bandaged wound. Ingrid moved to help him, and he was surprised by how gentle her large hands were, how carefully she steadied him. Can you shoot? He asked her. She shook her head. I can gut a fish and mend a net and stitch a wound. I cannot shoot a gun. In Norway, we do not have guns like this. Marlowe nodded, had expected as much. He moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight, and peered through a gap in the curtain. 3 men, just like Ingrid had said. Clayton sat on the ground, water from someone's canteen being poured over his burned face. Butch and the 3rd man, Marlowe recognized him as Tommy Pike, another known rustler, stood by their horses, guns drawn, discussing their options. They had time, they thought. The cabin had no back door, no escape route. They could afford to wait, to plan, to do this right. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated Ingrid Halvorsen. And they'd underestimated what a wounded deputy with nothing to lose would do to protect the woman who'd saved his life. Night fell over the desert like a curtain, bringing cold that seeped through the cabin walls and made Ingrid shiver in her ruined wedding dress. The men outside had built a fire, settling in for a siege. Marlowe watched them from the window, his face grim in the lamplight. The wound in his side had stopped bleeding, but Ingrid could see the pain etched in every line of his body, could see how he favored his left side, how his breathing came shallow and careful. He needed rest, needed proper care, but instead he stood guard with his gun ready and his jaw set like granite. She'd never met anyone like him, this stubborn American who refused to die no matter how much blood he'd lost, who looked at her like she was worth protecting even though they'd known each other for barely 3 hours. Tell me about Norway, Marlowe said suddenly, still watching the fire outside. Ingrid blinked in surprise, then understood. He was trying to keep them both calm, trying to make the weight bearable. It is cold, she said, settling into the chair by the table, her hands working unconsciously at the torn lace of her dress. Always cold, even in summer. But beautiful cold, with mountains that touch the sky and fjords so deep and blue they look like pieces of heaven fell into the earth. My father was a fisherman. Every morning before dawn he would take his boat out into the North Sea, and my brothers would go with him. I wanted to go too, but he said the sea was no place for girls. So I stayed home and learned to mend nets and preserve fish and help my mother with the younger children. When Clayton's letter came, I thought maybe God was giving me a chance to be something more than just the fisherman's daughter who was too tall to find a husband. Marlowe turned to look at her, and in the lamplight she could see something in his eyes that might have been understanding. My mother wanted me to be a shopkeeper, he said. Thought being a lawman was too dangerous, too uncertain. She died worrying about me, probably. But I couldn't stand behind a counter selling fabric and flour when I knew there were men out there hurting people. Someone has to stand between the wolves and the sheep, even if the sheep don't always appreciate it. Even if standing there means you might die in a cabin in the middle of nowhere with a bullet hole in your side. He said it matter-of-factly, no self-pity, no drama. Just a man stating a truth he'd made peace with long ago. Ingrid felt something shift in her chest, some recognition of a kindred spirit, someone else who'd chosen a hard path because the easy one felt like dying by inches. Outside, Clayton called to her. "Ingrid, my beautiful Norwegian bride. I'm willing to forgive you, darling. You were scared, that's all. Overwhelmed by the wedding, by everything being so new. I understand. We can start over. Just come out and I promise no one will hurt you. We'll go back to Copper Ridge, have a proper wedding night, begin our life together the right way." His voice was smooth again, the pain from the burns carefully hidden. He was trying to sound reasonable, loving, like a concerned husband worried about his confused wife. But Ingrid heard the undercurrent of rage, heard the threat wrapped in the promise. "Come out and I'll hurt you in private instead of public. Come out and I'll teach you what happens to women who defy me. Come out and you'll learn that death would have been kinder than what I have planned." "No," Ingrid called back, and her voice was steady as stone. "I am not your wife. I will never be your wife. I do not marry men who ride with murderers and thieves. Go away, Clayton Merrick, and find some other foolish woman to trick with your beautiful letters." Silence followed her words, long and dangerous. Then Clayton laughed, and there was nothing human in the sound. "Butch," he said loud enough for them to hear, "I've changed my mind. When we get in there, kill the deputy first, then hold her down while I show her what she's been missing. I want her to understand exactly what she gave up when she ran from me. Then we'll see if she still has that smart mouth." Ingrid felt ice slide down her spine, but when she looked at Marlowe, his face was calm. Almost peaceful. "That's not going to happen," Marlowe said quietly, and Ingrid believed him. Not because she thought they could win against 3 armed men, not because she thought some miracle would save them, but because she saw in his gray eyes the absolute certainty of someone who would die before he let those words become reality. He'd already made the choice, had accepted whatever consequences came with it. And Ingrid realized she'd made the same choice when she'd thrown the acid, when she'd boiled the water, when she'd stood by the door with a knife instead of opening it and begging for mercy. They would stand together, this wounded American lawman and the Norwegian fisherman's daughter, and whatever came through that door would have to go through both of them. Outside, the men started moving, checking their guns, preparing for the final assault. Inside, Marlowe handed Ingrid the rifle from his saddle and began teaching her how to shoot. Ingrid's hands dwarfed the rifle, but they held it steady. Marlowe stood behind her, his breath warm against her ear as he explained the mechanics, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe out slowly before pulling the trigger, how to anticipate the kick that would slam the stock back into her shoulder. She smelled like wedding dress and dried blood and something clean, like pine forests and snow. Despite everything, the pain, the danger, the near certainty of death, Marlowe found himself noticing these details, storing them away like precious things. When she fired the first shot at the tin cup he'd set on the windowsill, she hit it dead center, and her eyes lit up with surprise and something like joy. "I did it," she said, turning to him with a smile that made her whole face transform. "Marlowe, I hit it." "You're a natural," he said, and meant it. Most people flinched on their first shot, pulled away from the noise and the recoil. But Ingrid stood firm, accepted the violence of the weapon as just another tool, no different from the fish-gutting knives she'd used all her life. Marlowe had seen men twice her size who couldn't shoot straight because they were too busy being afraid of the gun. But fear didn't seem to be something Ingrid wasted time on. She was afraid. He could see that in the way her pupils dilated when she looked at the door, in the slight tremor in her voice when she'd called out to Clayton, but she didn't let the fear control her. She moved through it like water moving through rocks, finding the path forward and taking it. That was rare. That was worth protecting. Outside, the fire was being extinguished. The attack was coming. Marlowe positioned himself by the door, gun ready, while Ingrid took the window with the rifle. They'd moved the lamp to the far corner so their shadows wouldn't give away their positions. The cabin had fallen silent except for their breathing and the soft whistle of wind through the canyon. Then came the sound they'd been waiting for, footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, boots crunching on gravel. 3 sets of footsteps, splitting up, surrounding the cabin. Marlowe met Ingrid's eyes across the darkened room and saw her jaw tighten, saw her finger move to the trigger. She was ready. They were both ready. When the first gunshot exploded through the window, showering them with glass, Ingrid didn't flinch. She just aimed at the muzzle flash outside and fired back. The scream that followed told them she'd hit something. "Tommy's down," Butch's voice shouted from somewhere in the darkness. She shot Tommy right through the shoulder. There was genuine surprise in his voice, maybe even a hint of respect. They'd expected a helpless woman, not someone who could shoot back. Another shot came, this time through the door, splintering the wood near Marlowe's head. He returned fire through the hole, heard cursing as whoever was out there scrambled for cover. The cabin filled with gun smoke, acrid and choking. Ingrid fired again, then again, working the rifle's lever action like she'd been doing it all her life. Marlowe wanted to tell her to conserve ammunition, but he could see she was in that place beyond thinking, operating on pure instinct and the will to survive. Then came Clayton's voice, ragged with pain and fury. "Burn it. Burn the whole damn cabin down with them inside. She wants to choose him over me? But they can burn together." Marlowe's blood went cold. Fire was the one thing they hadn't prepared for, the one enemy they couldn't shoot. He looked at Ingrid and saw his own fear reflected in her face. The cabin was old, dry wood that would go up like kindling. If they stayed inside, they'd burn. If they ran out, they'd be shot. They had seconds to make a choice that would determine whether they lived or died. Marlowe's mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. Then Ingrid spoke, her voice cutting through his panic like a blade through fog. "The cellar," she said. "We go down into the cellar. They will think we burned. When they come to look at the bodies, we come up behind them." It was insane. It was brilliant. Marlowe nodded, already moving toward the cellar door despite the pain that screamed through his side. Ingrid grabbed the medical bag and what supplies she could carry, then helped him down the rough wooden ladder into the darkness below. The cellar smelled of earth and potatoes and something long dead. It was barely tall enough for Ingrid to stand upright, and Marlowe had to hunch over, his wounded side protesting every movement. They heard footsteps above, heard something liquid being splashed against the walls, kerosene, probably, or lamp oil. Then came the whoosh of flames catching, spreading, eating through the old wood like a living thing hungry for destruction. Smoke began seeping through the floorboards above them, thick and black and suffocating. Ingrid pulled her wedding veil over her face, then over Marlowe's, creating a makeshift filter. They huddled together in the darkness, breathing through the thin fabric, listening to their refuge being destroyed above them. The heat grew intense, almost unbearable. Marlowe could feel Ingrid shaking against him, or maybe he was the one shaking. He couldn't tell anymore. Time stretched and warped in the smoke-filled darkness. Minutes felt like hours. He pressed his face against her shoulder, breathing in the smell of her through the veil, and thought about all the things he'd never told anyone, all the dreams he'd buried under the badge and the duty. If they died here, at least he wouldn't die alone. At least he'd die next to someone who'd fought with everything she had, someone who'd refused to surrender even when surrender would have been easier. Outside, he heard Clayton's triumphant laugh. "That's what you get, you Norwegian." The cabin collapsed inward with a roar like a dying beast, sending sparks shooting into the night sky. In the cellar, Ingrid felt the heat pressing down like a physical weight, felt the smoke filling her lungs despite the veil. Marlowe had gone limp against her, passed out from pain and smoke and blood loss, and she held his weight with arms that burned from exertion. The cellar door above them was on fire now, flames eating through the wood, and Ingrid knew they had only moments before it gave way completely and buried them in burning debris. She could hear the men outside, hear their boots approaching, hear Clayton's voice saying something about checking for bodies. This was their chance. Their only chance. Ingrid lowered Marlowe as gently as she could to the earthen floor, then positioned herself directly under the burning cellar door, rifle in hand. She counted to 3 in Norwegian, the way her father had taught her to count before diving into the cold sea. Then she pushed upward with all her considerable strength, ramming her shoulder into the burning door. It exploded outward in a shower of sparks and flaming wood, and Ingrid erupted from the cellar like something being born from fire itself. Her wedding dress was scorched black, her face was covered in soot, her hair had come loose from its pins and hung wild around her shoulders. She looked like a vengeful spirit, like something out of the old Norse sagas her grandmother used to tell. The three men stood frozen in shock, Clayton with his burned face, Butch with his gun half raised, Tommy clutching his bleeding shoulder. They'd expected corpses. They'd expected victory. They hadn't expected this giant burning woman rising from the ruins. Ingrid fired the rifle from her hip, not bothering to aim, just firing again and again at the shapes in front of her. One shot hit Butch in the leg and he went down screaming. Another whistled past Clayton's head, making him stumble backward. Tommy tried to raise his gun with his good arm, but Ingrid was already moving, closing the distance between them with long strides, swinging the rifle like a club. It connected with his wounded shoulder, and he collapsed with a shriek. Then Clayton was on her, tackling her to the ground, his hands around her throat, his burned face twisted with rage. "You should have married me," he hissed, spittle flying from his mouth. "You should have been grateful. I saved you from poverty. I gave you everything." His thumbs pressed into her windpipe, cutting off her air. Ingrid's vision started to gray at the edges. Her hands clawed at Clayton's face, at his arms, finding no purchase. This was how she would die, she thought distantly, strangled by a man who thought he owned her, killed for the crime of saying no. Her mother's face flashed before her eyes, then her father's, then her brother's. They would never know what happened to her. They would wait for letters that would never come, would wonder if America had swallowed their daughter whole. The thought filled her with such rage that she found strength she didn't know she possessed. Her hand scrabbled in the dirt beside her, found something, a piece of burning wood from the collapsed cabin. She grabbed it despite the pain, despite her palm blistering from the heat, and drove it into Clayton's side. He screamed and rolled away, and Ingrid sucked in a desperate breath. She crawled toward the cellar opening, toward Marlowe, her vision still spotty, her throat raw. Behind her, she heard Clayton getting to his feet, heard the click of a gun being cocked. "Turn around," he said, his voice thick with pain and hatred. "Turn around and look at me when I kill you. I want to see your face when you realize you made the wrong choice." Ingrid turned slowly, still on her hands and knees in the dirt, and looked up at the man who would have been her husband. His face was a ruin of burns and rage, his gun steady despite his injuries. This was the end. She'd fought as hard as she could, had survived longer than she had any right to, but in the end, Clayton would win. Men like him always won. Then a voice spoke from the darkness of the cellar, weak but clear. "No," Marlowe said, and the gunshot that followed echoed across the canyon like thunder. The bullet took Clayton in the chest, center mass, exactly where Marlowe had aimed despite the pain and the smoke and the fact that he was firing from a prone position in a cellar half buried in debris. Clayton's gun fell from his hand as he stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock, looking down at the spreading red stain on his shirt as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe some final threat or curse, but only blood came out. Then he fell, hitting the ground hard, and didn't move again. The canyon fell silent except for the crackling of the dying fire and Butch's whimpering from where he lay clutching his wounded leg. Tommy had passed out from pain. The siege was over. They had survived. Ingrid crawled to the cellar opening and looked down at Marlowe, who still held his gun raised, his face gray as ash, his bandages soaked through with fresh blood. "You came back," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. "I thought you were dead. You were not breathing, you were so still." Marlowe managed a weak smile. "Takes more than smoke and bullets to kill a stubborn deputy," he said, then coughed, and Ingrid saw blood on his lips. The wound had reopened, or maybe the exertion had started internal bleeding. Either way, he was dying again, and this time she might not be able to save him. But she could try. She would try. She owed him that much, owed him everything. She climbed down into the cellar, ignoring the burns on her hands, the pain in her throat, the exhaustion that made her limbs feel like lead. The nearest town with a real doctor was Copper Ridge, 10 miles away. Ingrid found the horses, Marlowe's bay and the one she'd stolen, plus Clayton's mount and the two belonging to his men. She chose the strongest-looking animal, a gray gelding, and somehow got Marlowe onto its back, then climbed up behind him, holding him steady with one arm while she guided the horse with the other. Before they left, she tied Butch and Tommy with rope from the cabin's ruins, tight enough that they couldn't escape but not so tight they'd lose circulation. Let the law deal with them. Let someone else decide their fate. She was done with violence, done with death. All she wanted now was to save the man who'd saved her, to find some measure of peace in this brutal land. The ride to Copper Ridge took 3 hours, and Ingrid talked the entire time, telling Marlowe stories about Norway, about her family, about the time her brother Olaf had fallen through the ice and she'd pulled him out by his hair, about her grandmother's recipes for fish stew, about anything and everything she could think of to keep him conscious and fighting. Sometimes he responded, mumbling words she couldn't quite hear. Sometimes he just breathed, each breath a small victory. The sun rose as they reached the town, painting the desert in shades of gold and pink, and Ingrid thought that maybe America wasn't entirely ugly, maybe there was beauty here too if you survived long enough to see it. People came running when they saw her, the giant woman in the burned wedding dress, covered in soot and blood, carrying a wounded deputy. The doctor worked on Marlowe for 6 hours while Ingrid sat in the waiting room, still wearing her ruined dress, refusing to leave until she knew if he would live. The sheriff came, took her statement, sent men out to collect Butch and Tommy and Clayton's body. He told her she was a hero, that she'd helped catch 3 wanted criminals, that there was reward money coming. Ingrid didn't care about any of it. She just sat and waited and prayed to the God of her childhood, promising that if Marlowe lived, she would build a life in this country worthy of his sacrifice. When the doctor finally emerged, exhausted but smiling, saying the deputy would survive, would recover fully given time, Ingrid felt something inside her finally break. She wept, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body, releasing all the fear and pain and terror of the past 24 hours. 3 months later, Ingrid Halvorsen stood in the same church where she'd run from Clayton Merrick, wearing a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself. The pews were full this time, townspeople who'd heard the story of the Norwegian bride who'd fought off 3 outlaws, patients she'd been treating as the town's new nurse, friends she'd made in her months of staying and helping and learning. And at the altar waited Marlowe Garrett, still moving a bit stiffly from his wound but alive, healthy, and looking at her like she was the sunrise after the longest night. When the preacher asked if she took this man to be her lawfully wedded husband, Ingrid said yes in a clear, strong voice, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Outside, the desert wind blew gentle and warm, carrying the promise of seasons to come, of a life built on truth instead of lies, of a love forged in fire and survival. And Ingrid Halvorsen, the fisherman's daughter from Norway who'd traveled across an ocean to find herself, finally understood what it meant to be home. The end. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales. And don't forget, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Your support means everything. Until next time, remember, sometimes the wrong path leads you exactly where you need to be.